Hello and welcome to this UNESCO Masterclass Session 3 on Climate Change Impact on Food Security. I am Morgan Wairyu from the Pacific Center for Environment and Sustainable Development at the University of the South Pacific. And today we will look at climate change impact on food security. Now at the end of this session, you will be able to describe food security and its 4 pillars or dimensions, describe climate change and how it impacts on the 4 pillars of food security, and discuss how climate change impacts on vulnerable groups. Now, the following slides contain information relevant to the 3 learning outcomes. Now, the World Food Summit of 1996 defined food security as existing when all people at all times have access to sufficient, safe, nutritious food to maintain a healthy and active life. Food security also includes both physical and economic access to food that meets people's dietary needs as well as their food preferences. Now, when we talk about physical access, it involves food production, and in the case of the Pacific region, we've been experiencing per capita food production decline over the past decade. When we talk about economic access, it involves a number of factors, and they include land tenure, rapid urbanization, poor governance, and lack of technical and administrative capacity, unsustainable land use practices which support long-term agriculture productivity. It also includes low productivity resulting from inadequate resource management, lack of interest in agriculture, especially on the part of the youth. It also includes population growth, which adds to pressure on resources and increases poverty and hunger, especially in urban areas. And also include the deteriorating terms of the trade and international agreements that may conflict with food security goals. The diagram on this slide shows the 4 pillars of all dimensions of food security, and the 4 pillars include food availability, food access, food utilization, and food system stability. Food security exists when all pillars are equally present. Now, in terms of climate change and how it relates to food security, climate change as defined by the International Panel on Climate Change, it is described as a change in the state of the climate that can be identified, example, using statistical tests, by changes in the mean or the variability of its properties, for example, temperature, that persist for an extended period of time, typically decades or longer. Now, to put it more in simple terms, it's actually referring to the increase in weather over a period of time, which is normally around 30 years period. Now, the graph that you see on the right is a depiction of the increase in the average temperature from the period from 1860 to 2000. And you can see that the global average temperature has now increased by around 0.8 degrees. Now, how does climate change impact food security? Now, the impact can be described in short term as well as in long term. Short term impact results from more frequent and more intense extreme weather events like cyclone, flood, and drought, whilst long-term results from slow onsets of events such as high temperature, changing rainfall patterns, inundation, saltwater intrusion, and acidification. Climate change will affect all four pillars or dimensions of food security. When we talk about food availability, we refer to the sufficient amount of food that is present in a country or in an area through local food production, food imports, or food aid. In terms of food accessibility, it refers to the physical, social, and economic access to acquire adequate amount of food consistently through production, purchase, barter, or borrowings. Now, food utilization refers to safe and nutritious food that meets dietary needs for an active and healthy life. And food system stability refers to food and nutrition security resilience to natural and socio-economic shocks and political instability. Now, all these four pillars of food security will be affected by climate change. And this is how it will affect all four pillars. In terms of food availability, climate change will impact food availability by affecting water availability, habitats and species distribution, length of the growing season, ecosystem stresses, which include erosion by water and wind, acidification, salinization, and biological degradation. This will result in low yields and therefore low food production. Climate change will impact food accessibility through hazards or extreme events like cyclone, flood, drought, which causes damage to infrastructure, asset, crop losses and damage, loss of income, and employment opportunities. And when these are affected, it resulted in less access to food. Climate change will also impact food utilization through inadequate or lack of nutritional diet. Water-scarce regions in the world may face decreased water availability for drinking, sanitation, food processing, and consumption. Also, sea level rise or increase in heavy rain may result in increase in the number of people exposed to vector-borne diseases, for example, malaria, or waterborne diseases like cholera, and thus lowering their capacity to utilize food effectively. Climate change will impact food system stability by causing increase in livelihood risks, exerting pressure on food prices and higher dependency on food imports and food aid due to low food production. This is how climate change will impact the four pillars of climate change, of food security. Now, the evidence base for climate change on food security is still very patchy. There is still very little data to go by, but there is already a strong focus on production. There is already good observational data to support food production. For example, in Africa, production in the following crops have declined. There was observed 17% decrease in wheat production, 5% decrease in maize. And also, if we move into South Asia, we are already seeing a 16% decrease in maize production and also 11% decrease in sorghum production. Now, in the Pacific region, there is also evidence in climate change impact on food production, as shown here on this slide for various countries. You can see that even in high volcanic islands like Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Samoa and Tonga, people are already observing changes in crop yield, livestock production, and increase in incidences of pests and diseases. The same story also holds for the Pacific Atoll countries, like the Federated States of Micronesia, Kiribati, and Tuvalu, where sea level rise and salt water intrusion are real problems for food production. Now, climate change affects everyone, but worst affected will be those who are vulnerable. Now, vulnerable groups are those groups that are exposed to hazards or extreme events with limited resources and capacity, and are mainly dependent on agriculture, forestry, and fisheries for their livelihood. Now, the variations in assets and resources, or the ability to deploy them productively, are important in identifying the vulnerable groups. Now, when we are talking here about vulnerable groups, these may include women, the elderly, widowed or divorced, people with disability, chronically ill people, and also children and youth. These are the vulnerable groups that exist within our population that will be hardest hit by climate change. And when we talk about food security, these are the people or the groups that will suffer most. Now, people are affected differently depending on their livelihood and socio-economic status. Now, additional resources are available from the following websites, which the URLs are provided. You can go online to access these documents. We have now reached the end of this lecture. Thank you very much for staying with us, and we wish you enjoyable studies.